She always dreamed of freedom. But while her stepsister was walking down the aisle with a billionaire, she was quietly married off to the gardener. People laughed, unaware of who he truly was. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. At the far end of Rosewood Lane stood a grand estate, white walls, polished granite stairs, and arched windows that caught the afternoon light just so. To anyone passing by, it looked like the picture of grace and prosperity. But for Lillian, it was nothing more than a gilded cage, elegant on the outside but hollow within. She had grown up in that house, fine china, imported flowers, soft rugs, but never felt welcome. After her mother's sudden passing when she was only 9, everything changed. Her father remarried quickly. Margaret arrived dressed in charm and calculation. With her came Savannah, tall, graceful, with a camera-ready smile and a flair for being noticed. Savannah was everything Lillian was not: confident, admired, polished to perfection. She learned piano because it impressed guests. She studied French because it sounded expensive, and she posed for family portraits as if she were born to be famous. Lillian, in contrast, was quiet, thoughtful, and often overlooked. Her auburn hair and pale features reminded everyone, especially Margaret, of the woman who came before. Maybe that's why Margaret barely met her eyes. From the start, Margaret made it clear Lillian was a guest, not family. She was tolerated, not loved. When Lillian turned 18 and asked to attend university, Margaret told her to wait. "It's not the right time," she said. What Lillian didn't know then was that the tuition money had already been spent on Savannah's fashion school in Milan. Her father, always tired and distant, never stepped in. "Let's not start drama," he'd whisper when Lillian tried to speak up. By the time he passed away from a stroke, she had already learned to live quietly, to blend in, to endure. At the reading of the will, Margaret didn't flinch. It was clear she knew the contents long before the lawyer opened the envelope. Every asset, the properties, the shares, the cars, was left to her. Lillian received nothing but a vague line. "To my beloved daughter Lillian, I entrust Margaret with your care, trusting she will treat you as her own." It was less a gift and more a sentence. From that day on, her role became even smaller. She wasn't just ignored, she became invisible. She ran errands, scrubbed rooms, kept the candles burning for Savannah's return from spa appointments. She was no longer a daughter of the house, just another figure in the background. The staff noticed, but said nothing. Everyone knew. Margaret controlled everything, from the guest lists to the dinner seating. No one dared question her. Among them was a man named Daniel. Quiet and observant, he kept mostly to himself. The gardener, tall, dark-skinned, always working, before dawn, after dusk. He cared for the roses and trimmed the hedges with the same quiet precision. He lived in a modest room behind the greenhouse and rarely ventured outside his duties. Lillian barely knew him. Their paths crossed only in passing. Once, she saw him reading under a tree. Another time, fixing a leak when no one else would. They exchanged brief nods, nothing more. Then, one day, Savannah returned from a luxurious trip to the Seychelles. Her arm looped through that of a rising political star, Terence Adebola, son of a powerful senator and a name frequently whispered in the papers. What came next would change everything. Within days, the house turned into a whirlwind of plans and celebration. Margaret was glowing. Terence was the dream son-in-law, wealthy, well-connected, and seemingly taken with Savannah. Lillian watched from the sidelines, quietly stacking plates while the sound of champagne flutes echoed in the parlor. Then, one evening, something unusual happened. Margaret called a family meeting. Lillian, still holding a damp dish towel, was summoned to the drawing room. Waiting for her were Margaret, Savannah, and Terence, all seated with the air of a boardroom, not a family. Margaret smiled, too sweetly, and began, "We've been thinking, Lillian. It's time we spoke about your future." "My future?" Lillian asked, caught off guard. "Yes, dear," Margaret said, her voice calm but patronizing. "You're a grown woman now. It's time you had a home of your own." Savannah gave a smug grin and sipped her wine. Margaret continued, "We've made arrangements for you to be married." Lillian's heart skipped. "To who?" Margaret's eyes glinted. "Daniel." Silence fell like a stone. "The gardener?" Lillian whispered, not sure she heard correctly. "He's hard-working, and he needs structure. You need direction. It works out for both of you." Margaret's tone was laced with faux kindness, but her gaze was sharp as glass. Savannah couldn't contain her laughter. "A wedding in the garden? How poetic," she said, elbowing Terence, who chuckled politely, clearly unsure how to react. "You're not serious," Lillian said, her voice thin, but she already knew they were. "This isn't up for debate," Margaret said, folding her hands. "The papers will be ready next week. It'll be simple, efficient, no need for spectacle, and of course, you'll be moving to the gardener's quarters after." Lillian stood frozen. The towel slipped from her fingers. Her mind screamed, but her body stayed silent, trained by years of suppression. She turned and left without a word. Later, she couldn't recall how she made it to her room, or when she'd fallen asleep. Only the stillness remained, familiar, suffocating. That night, she sat by the window, watching as the light in Daniel's room flickered off. Somewhere inside, something quietly fractured, not from anger, but from a kind of weary surrender. She had spent her life trying to matter. Now even her future had been filed away like a task on someone else's checklist. But beneath the fog of helplessness, one thought glowed like an ember. "I will survive this." She always had. The following days blurred. No one asked how she felt. No one even brought it up, as if that evening had been no more significant than a dinner seating chart. But everything had shifted. The air felt heavier. Her room felt less like shelter and more like a waiting room for exile. Instructions didn't come from Margaret anymore. They arrived through staff. "Madam says you're expected at the registry tomorrow," or "Madam says to begin moving your belongings to the quarters." It became real the moment she saw her small suitcase waiting outside her door, zipped and upright, like it was standing at attention. That's when she knew this was happening, with or without her consent. She hoped, foolishly, that Daniel might protest, that he'd decline or even laugh it off. But if he had thoughts, he didn't show them. Whenever they crossed paths, he met her eyes with polite neutrality, no hesitation, no defiance, just quiet acceptance. The wedding came with no music, no flowers, no guests. Margaret had chosen a Thursday morning. The courthouse would be nearly empty. Fewer questions. Lillian was handed a cream dress, plain, shapeless, too big, something between a church uniform and forgotten formal wear. She rode to the courthouse in the housekeeper's sedan. Daniel arrived separately, sitting in the back of a work van as if it were just another delivery. Inside, the air was stale. The clerk didn't look up as he pushed papers across the counter. The magistrate read the vows like a grocery list. When the pen was finally handed to Lillian, she paused, just for a moment, as if she was deciding whether to sign her name or reclaim it. The pen felt far heavier than it should have. Lillian couldn't tell if it was her hand shaking or if it was her spirit resisting the inevitable. But in the end, she signed, not because she agreed, but because no one was left to stop it. No one left who cared enough to try. Daniel signed next. No hesitation, no ceremony, just a single motion of ink across the page, and just like that, it was done. No flowers, no rings, no witnesses. Legally bound, but emotionally vacant. Margaret didn't even bother to show up. Savannah most likely was at the spa. The quarters Lillian was sent to were clean, but sparse. a cot, a chipped table, and a window that overlooked nothing but dry earth. The kitchenette had a single burner and a leaky faucet. The bathroom in the back was barely usable. This, apparently, was her new life. Daniel's half of the building was equally modest. Same walls, separate doors, two lives forced into proximity without connection. They returned from the registry in silence. He walked straight to his room and shut the door. She did the same. Their silence wasn't awkward. It was vast. A quiet so heavy it filled every space between them. She unpacked her few possessions, her mother's old scarf, a handful of books, and a journal she hadn't touched in years. She tried to make the place livable, not cozy, just tolerable. In the mornings, their paths sometimes crossed. He'd nod on his way to tend the gardens. She'd nod back. One morning she left a cup of tea at his door. It came back later, empty but clean. That was the most they had shared. Meanwhile, the main house buzzed with laughter, parties, and Savannah's endless parade of visitors. Gleaming cars rolled in and out. Guests strolled the gardens Daniel kept pristine, while Lillian watched from her tiny window, unseen, unheard. Then one morning, something changed. She saw him by the old fountain, writing in a small notebook. The way he stood, focused, still, stayed with her. That evening, she spoke first. "I saw you this morning," she said, eyes on her plate. "Near the fountain. You were writing." He looked up. "I was." "What do you write?" He hesitated. "Plans, ideas." "For what?" He thought for a moment. "Future projects, business concepts, delivery logistics. I've been sketching models for efficient vendor networks in rural areas." She blinked. "That's detailed." "It's been in my head for years," he said. "I studied agribusiness, University of Agriculture, dropped out after my mother passed, had to take care of my younger brothers." Lillian leaned back, letting the silence settle. "And now you're here." He gave a small nod. "Now I'm here." Their silence afterward was gentler, not cold, just quiet understanding. That night, Lillian lay awake. She thought about all the dreams she once had, studying economics, traveling, working on empowerment initiatives, dreams she'd buried like dusty heirlooms behind locked doors. After that evening, things changed subtly. She still left him tea. He began slipping books under her door, worn paperbacks and agricultural magazines she'd never seen. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it mattered. Once she asked why he didn't reject the marriage. He didn't even look up. "Because I didn't have the strength to fight," he said simply. "And because sometimes survival means choosing the least painful kind of prison." She didn't argue. She knew exactly what that meant. Meanwhile, Savannah's wedding was in full preparation mode. Dress fittings, guest lists, decor samples, scheduled to military perfection. Lillian was excluded entirely, but for the first time, it didn't sting. Then, 3 days before the engagement party, Margaret summoned her. The order came through a servant as usual. Lillian entered the drawing room quietly, her hands still wet from the sink. "We'll need you and Daniel to finalize the court documents next week," Margaret announced without looking up. Lillian frowned. "But we already signed." "That was the registration," Margaret replied sharply. "This is the official civil certificate. It needs to be done before Savannah's engagement." "Why?" Margaret stood. "Because we don't leave loose ends. You don't have a job. You don't have a future. This is the best path you'll ever be offered." "That's not a path," Lillian said. "That's a sentence." Savannah strolled in, wrapped in silk and amusement. "She's still going on about marrying the gardener." She yawned, dropping onto the sofa. Lillian said nothing. She simply turned and left. That night, she cried. Not because of the marriage, but because of what it confirmed, that her life, her dreams, had been quietly dismantled piece by piece. Her hopes of education, of building something for herself erased. And just as Margaret dictated, the final civil signing took place. No ceremony, no one waiting, no celebration, just silence. Lillian and Daniel sat across from the clerk, answered questions, signed what needed to be signed. He wore a plain shirt. Her dress was stiff, unfamiliar, more costume than clothing. When it was over, they walked out without a word. 2 weeks later, Savannah's wedding lit up the estate like a royal affair. White and gold decor, crystal chandeliers, a live band. Lillian wasn't in the wedding party. She stood in the back, watching her half-sister twirl across the marble floor in a gown worth more than Lillian had ever seen in her life. Margaret beamed. The guests laughed, and in the corner by the gate, Daniel quietly opened it for each luxury car as they departed. That evening, Lillian walked to the gate with a covered plate and a small flask. "You haven't eaten," she said gently. Daniel looked up, surprised. "Thanks." She set the food down. Jollof rice, plantains, a little chicken. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something shifted. Not romance, not yet, but a mutual understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of what it meant to survive when the world had already made your choices for you. "I'm sorry they forced this on you," he said. "You've said that before. I never thought life would end up like this." "Same." They sat together, saying little. Then she added, "I was supposed to finish my degree next year, economics." He smiled faintly. "Good choice. I studied business management. Trouble came about a year after I graduated." She turned to him, surprised. "You graduated?" "I did." He nodded. "Most people just see the uniform." And for the first time, Lillian didn't feel like the invisible daughter married off to a gardener. She felt seen, and maybe that was the start of something real. From then on, the days stopped blending together. The air felt different at the far edge of the compound. Lillian didn't wake up with the same weight in her chest. She still didn't smile often, but something inside her had begun to move. Not joy, exactly, but something close, a slow thaw. Daniel's routine didn't change. He swept walkways before anyone else stirred, checked garden taps, trimmed hibiscus bushes, and cleaned the fountain no one visited. No one but him. Except now, there was more presence in the way he moved. He wasn't surviving. He was thinking. His notebook followed him everywhere. During breaks, he sat beneath the guava tree, scribbling diagrams, bullet points, loose sketches of plans. One afternoon, Lillian returned from the market to find him kneeling near a neglected patch of dirt behind the shed. Shirt soaked, hands working the soil slowly, intentionally. She paused, then stepped closer. "You're always here." He looked up. "There's work to do." She scanned the patch, dry, uneven, forgotten by the landscapers who only cared about perfect hedges and magazine-worthy symmetry. "This ground's useless," she said. "It's not dead," he replied. "It's just been ignored." He stood, brushing dust from his hands. With care, this plot could feed a small family, maybe two. She folded her arms. Why even bother? No one cares what's behind the shed. He gave her a small smile. Exactly why it matters. She didn't answer, but the words stayed with her. That night, from her window, she watched him again. Under moonlight, he was planting rows, not with grand gestures, just quiet motion, marking the soil with sticks, measuring invisible futures. The next morning, she found a paper bag at her door. Inside, a pair of gloves, a small note, and a packet of carrot seeds. "If you ever feel like getting your hands dirty." She stood holding the bag for a long while, then walked out to meet him behind the shed. Daniel didn't speak. He simply handed her a trowel. They worked side by side in silence. The sun climbed. Her arms ached. Her knees throbbed. But for the first time in months, she felt awake. Over the next week, they cleared the land, mixed compost that Daniel had prepared in old barrels, dug rows with a handmade rake. Lillian learned not from manuals, but from the soil itself. Her hands blistered, then toughened, her clothes stained. Her fingernails carried the memory of earth, but with each passing day came small, quiet victories: the first wriggling earthworm, the smell of soil freshly turned, the honest ache of muscles used for something meaningful. During breaks, they sat on stone steps and shared water, sometimes words, sometimes just breath, and slowly, the edge of the compound began to feel less like exile and more like a beginning. Daniel often spoke about the village he grew up in. Every family had a garden, and every child was expected to care for it. He'd tell Lillian about his mother's yam fields, his first time using a laptop in university, and that short internship at a logistics company, the one that ended when life pulled him in another direction. "I used to believe education was enough," he said one evening, staring out toward the horizon. "If I got my degree, I'd be fine. But the world doesn't always reward effort. Sometimes it punishes the ones who are unprotected." Lillian nodded slowly. "I thought being quiet and good would shield me. It didn't." They exchanged a look, not of pity, not of romance, but of shared understanding, recognition. Two people shaped by disappointment. Their garden became a refuge. No one from the main house came near it. Even the workers kept their distance. The dogs, once loud and territorial, started sleeping peacefully under the shade of their growing crops. Lillian began keeping a notebook, recording planting schedules, watering intervals, pest behavior. She read about composting, organic methods, and sustainable farming online. Daniel showed her how to spot healthy roots, how to read a plant's posture like a mood. Together, they built a basic irrigation system from salvaged pipes and an old rain barrel. One day, Daniel unrolled a map of the estate and pointed to a section beyond the western fence. "There's an old borehole here," he said. "Hasn't been used since the last renovation." "There's a greenhouse?" Lillian asked. "There was," he replied. "Savannah had it turned into a photo studio last year. Barely uses it now." She frowned. "So why not ask to restore it?" Daniel gave a dry smile. "Because they'll say no. But if we act, maybe they won't notice." She grinned. "Then we act." It became their quiet project, strategic, discreet, never announced. They fixed the borehole pump using parts Daniel had salvaged from the workshop. They laid pipes after dark, working in silence, using flashlights and muscle memory. In just under 2 weeks, they had water flowing straight to the garden. One morning, Daniel handed her a printed sheet, a grant application, detailed, sharp, full of ambition. He'd written it years ago for an international agriculture foundation. "You wrote all this?" she asked, genuinely impressed. "I never sent it in," he said. "Life got in the way." "Let's update it," she said. "Make it better, then we send it." He raised a brow. "You'd help?" "Of course. This isn't just a garden. It's a blueprint." So at night, they sat at the kitchen table and rewrote it together. Lillian revised the grammar, tightened the formatting, added projections. Daniel broke down logistics, sourcing, and scaling models. They debated word choices, laughed over typos, argued over fonts, and when they submitted the final version, they both felt it. Something had changed, not just in the paper, in them, but their progress didn't go unnoticed. Margaret didn't say anything directly, but the tone around the house shifted. A complaint here, a sudden inspection there, a sharp remark to the cook about people forgetting where they belonged. Savannah, blissfully unaware, continued sharing her lifestyle on social media. Expensive dinners, luxury shopping, spa days. One photo showed her beside her husband and a new Maserati with the caption, "When you upgrade from the basics." Lillian saw it while passing through the kitchen. She said nothing, but when Daniel saw it, he smirked. "That model has a brake system recall." She smiled, for the first time in days. Back in the garden, progress blossomed. The spinach was thick, carrots popped from the soil, tomatoes glowed red in the sun. They gave some to the cook, who quietly started returning the kindness, slipping them extra eggs, rice, ingredients. A silent alliance was forming among those the main house never noticed. Then came the email. Daniel was sitting under the guava tree when he read it. His hand froze mid-scroll. Lillian rushed over. "What is it?" He turned the screen toward her. "Congratulations. Your proposal has been selected for the second round of review. Please prepare the following documents." Lillian gasped, hand to mouth. "You did it!" "We did it," he replied. That evening, they sat on the stone steps, watching the sunset behind the wall. The air smelled of basil and wet earth. Lillian leaned against the wooden post and let out a long, quiet breath. "For the first time," she whispered, "this place doesn't feel like a cage." Daniel nodded. "Because we've started digging underneath the walls." And beneath those walls, silently, steadily, their roots were already growing. The announcement shifted everything. It was like someone cracked open a door they hadn't known was there. And through that door came a soft light, not blinding, but warm, that reshaped everything they thought was possible. From the margins, they had stepped into something real, something recognized. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like survival. It looked like possibility. Both Lillian and Daniel knew the path ahead wouldn't be smooth. It would be steep, uncertain, and watched by eyes that hoped they'd fail. And sure enough, in the days that followed, the tension didn't come from each other. It crept from the main house. Margaret's glances became sharper, colder, more frequent. She began asking pointed, unnecessary questions. Who had access to the quarters? Why the gardener's electricity was still on past 10? Whether the hose by the back fence had been used without permission. It was never really about the hose. It was about control, about the fear that something she discarded was starting to grow beyond her reach. But Daniel didn't flinch. He kept moving with quiet confidence, as if nothing Margaret did could shake what they were building. Every day he studied the foundation's grant requirements, legal docs, proof of land use, financial statements. He tracked down former professors, old classmates, anyone who could help recreate his academic record. Lillian supported him however she could, making phone calls, typing letters, scanning documents, organizing files on a dusty old laptop Daniel had fixed himself. At night, she read grant writing guides and business blogs until she fell asleep at the table, pencil still in hand. Daniel would find her like that and gently drape a blanket over her shoulders before returning to his work. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were creating something, together. The first big step was registering the business name. They went to the local registry dressed simply but neatly. Daniel in a white shirt and pressed black pants, Lillian in a soft blouse and slacks. The clerk barely looked up until he glanced at the proposal they'd attached. "Organic logistics and urban farming integration?" he muttered. "That's ambitious." "We're ambitious people," Lillian replied calmly. 3 days later, the certificate arrived. With that, they began searching for land outside the compound. They couldn't use anything on Margaret's property, no matter how many hours Daniel had poured into it. So they walked through wild lots, forgotten patches of land, meeting tired landlords and skeptical agents. It was Lillian who found it, a sloped plot near a public school, covered in weeds and rocks. But the drainage was good, and a water source was close. It was affordable only because everyone else had overlooked it. To them, it was perfect. They scraped together the deposit, part savings, part a small loan from one of Daniel's old classmates who now worked at a bank. The grant from the foundation would only come if they passed the second review. Until then, they had to build from faith and grit alone. Meanwhile, Margaret's patience wore thinner by the day. Marrying off Lillian to a gardener was supposed to end the problem, not fertilize it. Her dinners with Savannah turned bitter. "She's doing this to spite me," Margaret snapped one night. "That girl always had a quiet streak of rebellion." Savannah shrugged. "I think she's just bored. Let her play farmer. Who cares?" "I care," Margaret hissed. "She's getting emails from international organizations. If people start looking into the estate..." Savannah sat up. "Wait, what emails?" Margaret's face tightened. "Never mind." But it was too late. Savannah started watching. She noticed Lillian leaving early, returning late, her apron dusted with soil. She saw Daniel carrying blueprints, overheard their hushed planning sessions, and one afternoon she stopped Lillian outside the service quarters. "So," she said with syrupy sweetness, "I hear you're becoming a businesswoman." Lillian said nothing, just wiped her hands on her apron. Savannah went on, smiling too hard. "You really think you can build something serious with him?" Lillian met her gaze steady. "I know we can." Savannah laughed. "Well, just be careful. Would be ashamed to plant so much hope into something and watch it rot." Lillian didn't respond. She walked away. But her silence wasn't defeat. It was protection. As the garden flourished, so did their vision. They turned the sloped land into raised beds, marked out planting rows, built a small tool shed. They hired 2 local teens, offering wages and teaching them everything they knew. Lillian began tracking every expense, keeping receipts down to the last coin. They photographed the progress daily. Then it came, an email from the foundation. Daniel read it on a Tuesday morning, sitting under the guava tree. His hands froze. Lillian rushed over. "What is it?" she asked. He turned the screen toward her. "Congratulations. Your proposal has advanced to the final stage. You've been awarded a grant of $200,000, half to be dispersed now, the rest after initial audit." Lillian gasped, then laughed, loud and sudden. Daniel didn't say a word. He just smiled and looked at her like the whole world had shifted. And maybe it had. Her laughter turned into tears, but Daniel didn't say a word. He just reached out, took her hand gently, and let her cry. When word of the grant spread through the compound, it traveled fast. The cook told the housekeeper. The housekeeper told the driver. The driver mentioned it to the gate guard during shift change. Within 24 hours, Margaret knew. She summoned Lillian to the main house, the first time in weeks. The drawing room was cleaner than she remembered. The AC hummed quietly. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, dressed like she was about to give a press briefing. "So it's true," she said coolly. "You actually fooled some foreigners into funding your little backyard show." Lillian didn't blink. "It's not a show, and I didn't fool anyone." Margaret leaned in, voice sharper. "You think this makes you powerful? Independent?" Lillian met her gaze. "It makes me free." Margaret's nostrils flared. "You're still living under my roof." "No," Lillian said calmly. "I'm building my own." That night, Margaret called a lawyer. By morning, a typed eviction notice was slid under their door. 30 days to vacate the quarters. Lillian read it silently, folded it, and handed it to Daniel. He glanced at it once and said, "She's scared." "She should be," Lillian replied. They didn't waste time with outrage. They worked faster. They packed tools, moved essentials to the new land, and converted a small back room into temporary housing. Daniel's friends helped again. Someone donated a used generator, another brought secondhand shelving. Lillian reached out to a nearby church, and within 10 days, they were gone. No fanfare, no goodbyes, just a quiet, final exit. Margaret watched from her balcony, lips tight. Savannah didn't even look up from her phone. A week later, a small local paper ran the headline, "Grassroots Farming Initiative Receives International Grant." Below it, a photo, unposed, real. Lillian and Daniel, standing in their field, hands on hips, sunlight behind them, Margaret tore the paper in two. Across the city, under the shade of a newly planted tree, Lillian unfolded her own copy, smiled, and whispered, "We're not in the dark anymore." The new land wasn't polished. It was wild, uneven, but it breathed. And that breath, raw and real, felt more like home than the marble estate ever had. They slept on wooden pallets, wrapped in sleeping bags, under a roof that leaked when it rained. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, but it was theirs. They started with structure. A shipping container was converted into storage. The old shed was extended with reclaimed timber. Windows were cut and screened. The door was painted forest green, not for beauty, but to match the life they were growing. Half the grant money arrived right on time. It went into a new business account, and with it came responsibility, monthly reports, audits, proof of impact. Lillian took the lead. Her past, shaped by being overlooked, now sharpened her focus. She registered employees, filed taxes, answered inspectors with precision and clarity. Daniel stayed in the fields, adjusting irrigation, building trellises, testing compost. He trained the 2 teenagers they'd hired, and before long, they spoke confidently about soil pH and seasonal rotations. What was once a garden had become a working farm, and that farm became a message. Meanwhile, back at the estate, things began to fall apart. Not the walls, but the illusion. Margaret's business saw investors pull out. Suppliers demanded payment up front. The reputation she'd leaned on for years began to crack. Even Savannah's husband, Terrence, once the polished poster child of elite success, was under scrutiny. Whispers spread of shell companies, shady real estate deals, and legal probes. He denied it all with trained charm. But Savannah noticed the unanswered texts, the cold greetings at parties, the edge in his laugh. Back at the farm, the first major harvest came in late September. Tomatoes, spinach, sweet corn, cucumbers, every crate lined up in the shade of the processing area. They sold at 2 local markets and delivered to restaurants testing new farm-to-table menus. Every kilogram was weighed, every delivery logged, every naira accounted for. What began as survival had become structure. What was once exile had become leadership. And for the first time in their lives, Lillian and Daniel weren't working beneath someone else's ceiling. They were building the roof above their own heads. Lillian could hardly believe the numbers on the screen, not because they were massive, but because they were theirs. Every digit was a reflection of their labor, their defiance, their belief. A week later, a journalist from a national paper showed up, sunglasses too big for her face, voice crisp, questions sharp. "What made you start this?" Daniel glanced at Lillian. She answered, "Necessity," then added, "and dignity." "What does success mean to you?" the reporter asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. Feeding people without damaging the soil, hiring people without using them, building something that doesn't depend on your last name. The article ran under the headline, "From Servants' Quarters to Soil Innovators." No photo of the estate, no mention of Margaret. But everyone who read it knew exactly who had been left out, and why. At the estate, the newspaper appeared, torn, burned, stuffed in the fireplace. Margaret didn't speak of it, but she started making calls, not to demand, to beg. Her first attempt came through a mutual contact, a subtle offer. Perhaps Lillian might consider helping with family affairs, now that she had proven herself. The offer went unanswered. The second attempt was far less subtle. She arrived at the farm in person. A sleek black car pulled up. Margaret stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses, her elegance still intact, barely. Lillian was near the compost bins, hands dirty, apron dusted. She saw her, walked forward. "I just want to talk," Margaret said. "I'm listening," Lillian replied. Margaret hesitated. "The house," Things aren't as steady as they used to be. I know we've had our differences, but you're still family." Lillian didn't flinch. "I was never treated like family." Margaret pressed her hands together. "That was before. People make mistakes, but surely you don't want to see everything your father built fall apart." Lillian's voice was calm. "My father didn't build what you had. He left it to you, and you used it to shrink others, including me." "I was trying to protect Savannah's future," Margaret said, voice trembling. "No," Lillian replied. "You weren't trying. You just didn't care." "That's different." Margaret looked away. For the first time, the Polish cracked. Her voice thinned. Her posture sagged. Lillian didn't raise her voice. "I don't hate you," she said, "but I'm not your solution." "You won't help?" Margaret whispered. "I am helping," Lillian said. "Just not you." Margaret turned and left in silence. The next day, a letter arrived from a nearby girls' school. The principal asked if her students could visit the farm to learn about sustainability and entrepreneurship. Lillian and Daniel said yes immediately. They prepared stations, composting, irrigation, crop rotation. Lillian spoke to the students about choice, ownership, and building when no one offers you space. One girl, maybe 15, lingered after. She whispered, "My stepmother says girls like me should just marry early and stop thinking so much." Lillian smiled. "Then think louder." Word spread. 2 more schools booked visits. A women's cooperative reached out for help launching a similar farm in their village. A local official scheduled a meeting. Lillian began writing a workshop curriculum. Daniel started mentoring young men interested in agricultural logistics. They weren't just building a farm anymore. They were building a movement. The second half of the grant arrived. They expanded the processing center, installed a solar-powered water pump, fenced the entire property. They bought a delivery van and stamped it with their logo, green roots beneath a raised fist. Then came the news. Terrence had been arrested. Charges: fraud, bribery, property violations. He was being held pending investigation. Savannah returned home, mascara streaked, phone buzzing with silence from people who used to praise her name. Margaret didn't speak for 2 days. Then she broke. The estate was crumbling. The house was under audit. Creditors had begun calling. Her driver had resigned. The housekeeper was gone. Even Savannah, hollowed by shame and loss, refused to eat, blaming her mother for everything. Margaret came back to the farm, but this time she wasn't wearing luxury. Her shoes were scuffed, her voice unsteady. Her hands shook. Daniel opened the gate. "I need to speak to Lillian," she said, barely audible. He led her through the rows of vegetables and fruit-bearing vines. Lillian was inside sorting seeds when Margaret stepped through the door. There was no gasp, no drama, just recognition. "I know I don't deserve anything," Margaret said, "but please, help Savannah. She's lost everything." Lillian put down the seeds. "I can't undo the past," she said. "I can't fix what was built on silence and lies, but I can offer her a place in the next training group if she's ready to learn." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Thank you. I'm not doing it for you," Lillian said. "I'm doing it for who she could become." After Margaret left, Daniel came in with 2 cups of tea. Lillian took one and sat beside him on the bench. "You didn't have to be kind," he said. "I wasn't," she replied. "I was fair." He nodded. And in the quiet that followed, beneath a fading sky and the scent of fresh earth, they sat side by side. 2 people who had once been cast out, now the center of something just beginning to bloom. The farm stretched out around them like something alive, not tamed, not rushed, just content to grow at its own pace. What Lillian and Daniel had built couldn't be bought, and what they had lost, they no longer wanted it back. The morning sun rolled softly over the rows of crops, casting a golden hush across the land. Dew still clung to the pepper leaves like silver droplets. Lillian stood at the edge of the first row, clipboard in hand, pencil tucked behind her ear. Her eyes swept across the field, not to count, but to remember. She didn't need numbers anymore. These rows were etched into her the way years etch into the palms of working hands. Routine had become her quiet ritual, not for control, but for grounding. A reminder that nothing in front of her came from chance or privilege. It all came because she refused to disappear. The past months hadn't made her harder. They'd made her sharper, more focused. Since Margaret's last visit, Lillian hadn't looked back, not out of bitterness, but because there was nothing left to turn toward. The estate, the name, the legacy, it had all been built without her. Now it stood behind her like a faded photograph. The girl who once haunted its halls had become solid. Out here, in the open, under sun and sky, she cast shadows. Daniel moved quietly along the irrigation lines, checking the valves, adjusting the flow. He still carried that calmness he always had, but now it was different. He didn't move like someone working a job. He moved like someone tending land he designed. Together, they had turned the farm into a cooperative. With the remainder of the grant, they built a second greenhouse, this one for seedling research and experimental crops. Lillian partnered with the local university, trading monthly field data for expert consultation. What they grew now wasn't just food, it was knowledge. And the women's foundation Lillian had quietly envisioned, it was real. It started with 3 referrals from a women's shelter, a survivor of domestic abuse, a young woman who had aged out of foster care, and one who had been trafficked and rescued. None of them had ever touched a seed or swung a hoe, but Lillian trained them, firm but fair. Within weeks, they were planting, harvesting, teaching new volunteers how to navigate the rows. Each woman received a stipend, support services, and access to counseling. Lillian reached out to an NGO to provide health checks and transportation. She wrote a 5-year roadmap, now pinned to the wall in what had once been a dusty storage room, now their admin office. Clean, earthy walls, a chalkboard, filing cabinets, and framed newspaper articles. Daniel had grown into something new as well. He became the face of field innovation, holding meetings, mentoring young farmers, and advising neighboring cooperatives. He no longer introduced himself as just a grower. He was now the director of agricultural systems at Green Roots Cooperative. His name appeared in journals and farming magazines, always with a modest headshot, always with a quiet bio that left out the part where he used to sleep behind a greenhouse. Then one morning, after hours of packing crates for delivery, Lillian sat down at her desk and opened an email. Subject: reinstatement approved. It was from her former university. Her hands trembled slightly as she read the words. She had applied months earlier on impulse. No one had expected a response. She'd left school without notice, without explanation, years ago. But now, her transcripts had been reconstructed. Her fieldwork counted as professional experience, and the university didn't just welcome her back. They offered a flexible part-time enrollment track that allowed her to continue managing the farm. Daniel walked into the office, sleeves rolled, shirt streaked with soil. She turned the laptop toward him. He read the email once, then again, and smiled slowly. "I always knew you'd go back," he said. "I didn't," she whispered. He sat beside her. "You just didn't know how strong you were." She enrolled the same week, evening and weekend classes. Her focus, developmental economics, with a concentration in agricultural reform. It wasn't lost on her, the irony. Once, her education was taken from her because someone else decided her dreams didn't matter. Now, it was back in her hands, a tool, a choice, a foundation she could stand on. At night, she studied at the same desk where she once cried over a life that had shattered. Now her textbook sat beside farm reports and grant paperwork. Daniel often joined her, reviewing workshop materials, highlighting journal articles, preparing his notes for a community class he'd been asked to teach. They weren't just rebuilding a life, they were rewriting its future. And for the first time, everything ahead of them felt like it truly belonged to them, not borrowed, not inherited, but earned. Their conversations deepened with time, no longer just about crops or weather, but systems, justice, and dreams that stretched far beyond the edges of their land. They debated food equity, imagined new supply networks, floated bold ideas, a second location, partnerships abroad, maybe even a research center one day. Yet despite their closeness, there had never been a declaration. No confessions. No defining moment. But it didn't matter. What lived between them didn't need a name. It had been formed through shared struggle, through dirt under fingernails and silent morning hours, through setbacks, laughter, and quiet victories. It was something lived, not labeled, and that made it real. One afternoon, as they walked the edge of the property, Daniel paused near the boundary fence. "I've been thinking of buying the lot next door," he said. "It's rocky, hasn't moved in months, but it's enough space for worker housing, maybe even a learning center." Lillian stopped beside him. "You want to expand? I want to own enough land that no one can ever threaten to take it away again." She nodded. "I'll help structure the financing. We can speak to the bank next week." He looked at her a long moment. "You always say 'we' now." Lillian smiled. "Because it's true." The purchase went through faster than expected. The bank, impressed by their financials and national press, approved a modest loan. Within weeks, construction began. Villagers came with tools in hand. The women of the cooperative laid bricks, planted trees, and painted walls with the same precision they once brought to rows of spinach and corn. It was hard, slow work, but it was theirs. The opening was quiet, no press, no ribbon cutting. Just the people who had helped build it. Staff, students, neighbors. Lillian stood before a mural one of the girls had painted, a great tree with roots shaped like open hands. "This isn't a gift," she said. "It's a right, a place for those who've been told they don't belong, a place to plant something and stay long enough to see it grow." The applause was soft, but it didn't need to be loud. It was steady, sure. That evening, Lillian and Daniel sat on the office porch, sipping ginger tea in the twilight. "You remember our first night in the quarters?" he asked. She nodded. "I thought I'd made the worst mistake of my life. I thought I'd never stop being the help." They sat in silence as the farm stretched before them, the lamps casting long shadows over the soil. Daniel set down his cup. "We built this with our hands, and no one can take it from us," Lillian said. In the distance, a group of women sang softly as they harvested under the stars, their voices drifting over the land like a lullaby. And for the first time in either of their lives, there was nothing to escape, only the open path ahead. The new center stood like a quiet promise at the edge of the field. Its golden painted walls caught the morning light, though parts were still raw, unfinished windows, paths waiting for gravel, a roof still vulnerable to storms. But no one inside cared. What it stood for couldn't be measured in paint or polish. It was a threshold, a space where people once cast aside had finally found direction. Outside, garden beds were already breaking soil. Inside, the first workshop was underway. On the chalkboard, written in careful block letters, were words painted by the girls of the cooperative over the course of a week. Growth takes root in courage. Some of them still struggled to read, but they knew what those words meant, not in theory, but in their bones. Lillian stood in the back, watching one of her former trainees teach new arrivals how to germinate seeds in trays made from recycled plastic. Her hands ached to join in. But this time, she wasn't the teacher. She was a founder, The title still felt too large, like a coat she hadn't grown into. But it was true. She was no longer supporting someone else's dream. She had built her own. Outside, Daniel was overseeing the installation of solar panels. A group of teenage boys gathered around him as he traced circuit diagrams on a wooden board, encouraging questions, explaining patiently. One of them asked why he didn't just hire electricians from the city. Daniel smiled. Because if you learn it here, you'll teach it here. That's how we grow. Later that afternoon, Lillian walked toward the farmhouse to collect reports. As she passed the main gate, her eyes fell on a new sign, just mounted the night before. Green Roots Initiative, Center for Land, Learning, and Livelihood. The lettering was carved deep into the polished wood, sealed in lacquer. She ran her fingers across it slowly, tracing every groove. No trace of Margaret. No echo of the estate. No legacy borrowed. Only what they had built. Inside the office, reports were neatly organized. Operations had become smoother than she ever imagined. Staff rotated with rhythm. Volunteers came and went, but the core team held strong. Women who once arrived broken now managed inventory, coordinated deliveries, trained others. One of them, Ann Kim, had even started her own small plot at home, now selling dried herbs to local pharmacies. It was working, not because they were lucky, but because no one had given them space, so they created it themselves. Lillian had helped her write her very first invoice. On the wall behind her, a calendar bore a single circle, marking the weekend ahead. 1 year, a full year since they'd walked away from a house that never felt like home. A year since Daniel's long-forgotten grant application sprouted like a seed buried in darkness. They had decided to celebrate it quietly. No speeches, no banners. Just those who had made the journey possible. A night to cook together, share stories, harvest under the stars. Not a celebration of survival, a celebration of emergence. The evening arrived beneath a golden sky, a soft breeze carrying the scent of ripening guava and slow-burning firewood. Tables were placed beneath the neem trees. Pots of jollof rice, roasted yam, pepper soup, and grilled plantains lined the benches. The younger women had decorated everything with wildflowers and hand-painted cloth. Daniel's team had built the benches from reclaimed wood. There were no cameras, no headlines, only hands that had planted, lifted, taught, and healed. Lillian moved through the gathering, exchanging hugs, adjusting centerpieces, laughing softly. Then she saw her, Savannah, standing at the edge of the path, changed, thinner, simpler. No designer bag, no entourage, just a plain blue blouse, jeans, and a plastic container in her hands. Lillian approached. "I heard," Savannah said quietly, "about the center, about everything." Lillian didn't answer. Savannah held out the container. "It's pawpaw, from my garden. I thought maybe I could bring something." Lillian took the container, gave a quiet nod, then motioned for her to come in. Savannah followed, slowly, quietly, but she came. That night, after everyone had eaten and the fire had been lit, the singing began, soft at first, then rising, voices from memory, not performance, songs not taught, but remembered, not rehearsed, but felt. Daniel sat beside Lillian in the firelight. He didn't speak for a while. Then, "Do you ever think about that first day, when they told you to marry me?" Lillian smiled faintly. "Every day." He laughed gently. "If you could go back, what would you do?" She looked around at the circle, women eating, singing, glowing in the firelight. "I would have said no louder, and walked away on my own terms." Daniel nodded. "And now?" he asked. "Now I understand why I stayed." He didn't ask more. He reached for her hand, held it lightly. Across the field, the lights from the new center glowed steady, like the quiet heartbeat of a place that had finally found its name. In the weeks that followed, life shifted into rhythm again, one both familiar and full of forward motion. Lillian began her university classes. Twice a week she left early for campus, returning late with notebooks, ideas, and a fire in her eyes. Daniel adjusted his schedule. The team covered for her without hesitation. Then one morning, as she was about to leave, Daniel called her to the porch. He held out a small, simple box. "What's that?" she asked. "Something you should have received properly, a long time ago." She opened it. Inside, a silver ring, carved with a vine pattern. Nothing flashy, just honest. "I know we were pushed into something neither of us wanted," he said. "But what we built, that was ours. I'm not asking because of obligation or memory. I'm asking as someone who's shared this land, this fight, this life with you." Lillian looked at the ring for a long time. Then she slipped it on. It fit perfectly. "No speech?" he teased. She smiled. "We've already said everything. In action." There was no grand ceremony, no tuxedos, no gowns, just a quiet exchange of vows beside the greenhouse, with the morning roosters and the staff bearing witness. And then they went back to work. In the months that followed, the farm thrived. Lillian launched a podcast, amplifying women in agriculture. Daniel partnered with a tech startup to build an app connecting small farms to city buyers. Together, they helped launch 3 more cooperatives across the region, each carrying part of their blueprint, their vision, their story. Back in the city, the house where Lillian once faded into silence was sold at auction. Margaret had moved to a smaller home on the outskirts, far from the parties, far from the boardrooms. She lived quietly now. Occasionally, she called Savannah, who had begun coming to the center once a week, learning about soil health and crop markets. She never asked for special treatment. She always brought something from her garden. The past still existed, but it no longer had the final word. One evening, Lillian and Daniel stood on the balcony of their modest home, built beside the center, surrounded by everything they had grown. The moon rose, the trees rustled softly. Lights flickered across the land like stars returning home. "You know what amazes me?" Lillian said. "What?" "That we started in someone else's back quarters," she said, her voice warm. "And now, we're not just free. We're whole." Daniel pulled her close. "I didn't just find a farm," he said. "I found a partner. And I found peace," she whispered. Below them, laughter floated on the air, mingling with the scent of earth and life and everything they had planted. The land didn't remember who tried to bury them. It only remembered what grew and what remained. Built not from wealth, but from will. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that from the quietest seed, a forest can rise.